right now?
I do see your presentation, yes.
All right, perfect. All right, well, good morning, everybody, to your first class at the Code Academy. We've got a lot of information to go through today, and I know it's difficult to have to sit in a class and in front of a computer screen all day, but hopefully you'll get a lot out of today's class and the other classes you attend over the next couple days. It's exciting working on new certifications. So today's class is exam preparation techniques and learning to navigate the code. If we were actually, sometimes we teach this live, we're sitting in a large auditorium. Just so you know, the Ohio Fire Code does require us in large auditoriums to make an announcement to make sure you know where to get out should there be an emergency. But I guess since we're all sitting at home or in our offices at work, we kind of know where we need to go should there be an emergency. Um, my name again is Paul Kowalczyk. I am a building official for two jurisdictions, the village of Moreland Hills and the city of Pepper Pike. Those are located just to the south of Cleveland, Ohio, up in Northeast Ohio. I am also a registered architect in the state of Ohio, and I am the owner of Code Consultation and Plan Review Services, where I provide plans examination services for many jurisdictions up in the Northeast Ohio area. And I also consult with architects and engineers when they have issues on projects relating to code matters that they can't seem to solve. So there's quite a few of you sitting in class today. I actually sat in the Code Academy 17 years ago. So I know exactly what you're going through. 17 years ago, the Code Academy was actually a 5-day academy. We actually had to go down to Columbus for 5 days, and there was a lot of information, but it's been fine tuned over the years. But it is a great program. And if you get to know anybody through this process, really try to network and stay in touch with them, because a lot of the people that I actually went to the Code Academy with 17 years ago, I still am in touch with them today, because a lot of times I run into a situation where maybe I can't figure something out. And I do know that somebody else out there has probably already solved this problem and can kind of guide me on making a good solution. So the nice thing about doing something remote is I can actually offer you some virtual coffee and donuts. So why don't you sit back, grab yourself a virtual coffee and donut, and let me tell you kind of how this course came to be. I don't think anyone taking this class today actually woke up one morning and said, I want to grow up to be a building inspector. We've probably all ventured into code enforcement from various backgrounds. I've been doing code enforcement for over 22 years now. And during that time, I've actually sat on the board of directors for the Ohio Building Officials Association. And I'm also the past president of BACONIO, which is the Building Officials Conference of Northeast Ohio. And being on both those organizations, I've met a lot of people over the years. And what I heard from a lot of the members in our organizations is they didn't know what to study for these exams. They didn't know how to study for the exams. Or I've even met individuals who said, hey, I really know the code inside and out. I know that book. But when I actually sit down to take the exam, I actually freeze and I don't do very well. In my career over 22 years, I've taken 10 exams, and I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've learned a lot from taking these exams. But actually, like many of you, my background only exposed me to a small segment of the code. So let me kind of just take you back in my history. I actually went to architecture school, and at the time of architecture school, it was a 5-year program. Now it's 6 years to get through architecture school. But what I found really interesting when I look back about my 5 years of training to become an architect, and in the role I sit today, it amazes me that within my 5 years in architecture school, I was never required to take a class on how to understand the building code. When you got into your 4th or 5th year in the architecture program, college that I went to actually provided a course. It was an elective course that you could take if you wanted to know the building code. But to be honest with you, myself and a lot of my other classmates who are in architecture were, were becoming architects or wanted to become architects because of the art aspect behind designing a building. We wanted to make cool buildings. We wanted to do things that were really neat. And we all kind of sat around and figured that, there were engineers and other kind of people out there that would probably figure out all that code for us. We were just going to sit down and design these beautiful buildings and create wonderful spaces for people to go in, but we never really focused on how that was really going to get done. Well, I eventually graduated from architecture school and I got out in the real world, and you learn really quick that it takes three things to get a building built. One, you have to deal with a client, and dealing with a client, they often tell you what they want. It's not so much what you want. You also have to deal with a budget when you're out there, and the budget also restricts you to what you can do with these buildings. And then the third thing is, in order to get a building built, you're going to have to get a certificate of plan approval or a permit. And in order to do that, you're going to have to supply to the building department a code compliant structure. And in order to do that, you're really going to need to know how to use the code. To be honest with you, and I practiced architecture for over 13 years, and a lot of the early years in a lot of the offices that I worked with, a lot of the staff, we never even knew what the current edition of the code we were supposed to be following. We would just go to our code library in the office and kind of just pick up the book that had the most current date. We didn't realize that there was actually specific editions that we were supposed to be following. As well, when you're designing a building or a space, typically the architects work with a floor plan. You come up with your floor plan, you come up with your reflected ceiling plan. And then when you get to that stage, you basically take those documents and you send them off to your engineers and you let them figure out how all the lighting happens, how all the plumbing is going to be connected, how you're going to run that air through the building. And so we basically relied on our engineers to make sure that they knew that they were following their aspects of the code. And so I practiced, I was out after school, graduated. I worked for 3 years during my internship, and it was time to take my exam to become an architect. And at that time in the early 90s, to take an architectural exam, you had to sit through 4 days of 9 exams. You started on a Monday morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, and you finished your last exam on Thursday night at 8 p.m. And at that time, it was a paper and pencil exam. You weren't sitting in front of a computer, and you could only take that exam once a year. After that 4-day period, which was a very strenuous time, I ended up passing 8 of my 9 exams. I failed my mechanical exam by 1 point. And since it was only offered one time a year, I had to go back and a whole year later take it again. And I successfully passed the mechanical component, and I went on and got my certification as an architect. After going through that entire process, I said to myself, I would never, ever have to take another exam in my life because I got my architectural license, and that's what I always wanted to be, was an architect. Well, as I said, after practicing for 13 years, I decided to shift what I was doing with my life, and I came over to the public sector, and I got hired as a building official. And within that first year, I had to get my building official certification. Went on and got my building inspector certification, my master plans, and a couple other of the certifications. And all of a sudden, within that first year, I really needed to be an expert in all the code books that were out there. And as I said, my background, I really only dealt with the building code, but now I had to deal with the plumbing code, the fuel gas code, the mechanical code, and all those different things that were out there. And I didn't know what I needed to do. So I kind of learned a lot from this process, and going through all this really gave me an idea to develop a course that maybe can help you out as you go through this process. We're only going to be here for 2 hours today. We're not going to have by the end of today, but hopefully it can give you some tips and ideas you can build upon as you embark on this process of working towards your certification. A little bit about the intent of this course. It's to teach the code official how to successfully navigate the code book and develop study skills for preparing for the national certification exams. And towards the end, we're going to kind of look at some ways to decrease some of our anxieties when we actually sit down to take the exams. Now, hopefully, before you came into the class today, whether you're going for your commercial certification or your residential certification, that you've actually gone onto the Board of Building Standards website and you've actually looked at your requirements based on the certification you're looking for. At this point, coming into this class, right after you got your interim certification and were signed up for Board of Building Standards Code Academy, I'm hoping that you have gone to the this examination matrix and basically looked at what now are your requirements for your testing. If you haven't done that, I would say the first thing when you get completed with your Code Academy this week is you go on the Board of Building Standards website and you look for these tabs where you'll find your commercial certification matrix and your residential certification matrix. When you click on that, it's going to give you that matrix table, and over to the right-hand side is actually the columns that say your exam module requirements. And you have to determine yourself, which path are you going to take when you take the exams? Are you going to go through the ICC route, which is the International Code Council, because they're the main testing center that you can go through, or you do have an option to go through the NCP-CCI route, which is the National Certification Program for Construction Code Inspectors. So depending on what you wanted, what your certification is, you do have options on which exam modules you can take. There are 2 testing agencies out there. And later on in the program, we will go ahead and we will talk about those. For those in the class today that are going to be electrical safety inspector inspectors, you need to be aware of this note number 8, which is on that matrix. And basically, it says applicants for electrical and safety inspector must be authorized by the board prior to taking your required exam. So you can't just go out and take the exam if you're going for your ESI certification. You actually have to submit to the board first, and based on their requirements, they will give you the authorization to go ahead and take the exam. One of the nice things last year, in August of last year, for ESI applicants, you used to have to take 2 exams, but now they've reduced it to just 1 exam. So that was a very positive change that was made last year. The course that we're doing today is made up of 3 parts. The first part, we're going to talk about learning how to navigate the code book. Our second part is techniques for studying for the exam as we prepare to take the exam. And then the last part of our course today is how can we manage the exam process and kind of decrease some of our text anxieties while we are taking the exam. So if you do any research in the subject matter on test taking, one of the keys to mastering the code book is learning how to navigate that code book. Now, every day in our given job, basically that code book is our most essential tool that we have. It's basically our cookbook. It's our recipe for code enforcement. And it's very important in what we do as code officials that we have to understand how these code books are structured. As I said, my background as an architect, I'm really familiar inside and out the Ohio Building Code book. I mean, I know that book front to back and back to front. But one of the books I still struggle with today is the National Electrical Code. That's probably one of my weakest points in what I do. But there's a lot of times where a contractor could come up to the building department counter and have a question, an electrical question, and I can always grab that code book and I'll find what he's looking for, because I have learned over these years how these books are structured. And so I don't always know exactly the answer that they may be asking, but I can always refer to any single code book that I have and look for that answer, because I understand how they are all structured. Our duties as code officials is to know the code. It's important to stay current with the code changes. And right now, I got to be honest with you, we are going through our transition period. About every 6 to 7 years in the state of Ohio, we go through a major code cycle change. And just this past Friday, March 1st, we have now gone from the 2017 Ohio Building Code Series to the 2024 Ohio Code Series. And so as code officials, we now have to know this whole new set of codes that just went into effect this past Monday. And so, again, there are a lot of new code changes that went into effect, and now I have to start reviewing plans under the new code. We have to start anything that's going to be issued from March 1st on is now based on the requirements of the 2024 Ohio Building Code. And there were a lot of changes that went into effect. And as code officials, we have to know what those changes are. We have to be able to answer when somebody calls up and says, hey, I have this issue. Where are you going to find that in the code book? It's not our job to memorize the code, because a lot of times mistakes can happen when we think we know the answer. It's always important to refer back to the code. And especially right now, we have to refer back to the code, because a lot of these code sections have changed. A lot of the code numbers have changed. And the other thing about memorizing the code is there are differences between the I codes, which is the model code, which is developed by the International Code Council, and the Ohio codes that we enforce on a daily basis. As I said, there are differences. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see the International Building Code. That is the model code. That is what the test is taken from. On the right-hand side is the new 2024 Ohio Building Code. As of Monday, this is the new code that we are starting to enforce. You have the model code, which is where our test questions are taken out of, but the Ohio Building Code is what we enforce and what we become to know here in the state of Ohio. And there are differences between those two code books. Every time, as I said, we were in a new code cycle right now. When the state of Ohio takes that model code, they Ohioize it and they make changes specific to the state of Ohio. And potentially, if you just study from the Ohio Building Code book and you memorize something from the Ohio Building Code book, there are differences that when you actually sit down and take the exam, you could potentially make a mistake. Over the years, one of the reasons why we don't want to memorize anything is, here's one good example. There have been numerous changes over the years to the stair, riser, and tread requirements. So when you're building a stair, there are different requirements if that stair is being built in a home or if it is being built in a commercial office building. And if you got into this field maybe 10 years ago and you had memorized that one section of the code and you never looked back on it again, you will find that in every code cycle, this is the one area that seems to change over the years, specifically in the residential code. Because many of us are dual certified individuals, on any given day, I could be running into a commercial building for an inspection or a residential building. And depending on where your mindset is, you could potentially accept a commercial condition in a residential home. What I've done here on this chart is just show you that over the years, the stair, riser, and tread requirements have really changed. From the earliest days of 1968, you could have a stair riser that was 4.5 to 6 inches. and your tread could be no less than 12 inches. But as we've gone over the years with all the different codes that have come into play, you could see that that number changes as we've gone through all the different code cycles. And so it's very important that you continually refer back to the code book to make sure that you're staying current with what's currently in the code, because these things do change. And as I said, there are differences between the building code and the residential code. As you can see just on the bottom here, in a commercial building, you have to have a minimum tread depth of 11 inches, but in a residential home, it only has to be 9 inches. And so you want to make sure that we're not always memorizing these numbers, but if we're not sure, instead of guessing, always make sure you go back to the code. Another example of a lot of changes or a lot of things to know is there's a lot of material out there that is sold in our big box hardware stores, and not all that material that is sold in these stores are approved to actually be installed in the state of Ohio. Any type of approved material under the code will have a standard printed on that material. Just one example are there's many types of sewer pipes. So if I go into the plumbing code under the underground drainage and vent pipe, under this specific table, there are over 24 different standards that could be accepted on the material based on the installation. And so if I'm out at an inspection, I can tell you I don't have a photographic memory. It would be pretty hard to know and to memorize when I'm looking at a pipe out there, whether or not that pipe is manufactured under the proper standard based on this one section of the code. Well, it's not my job to memorize all these ASTM numbers, but it is my job to know where I can find this chart in the code book, so that if I'm out in the field and I'm not sure about that product that's being installed, I know exactly where to go in the code book to navigate to go ahead and find this chart. I talked a few slides ago about there are differences between the model codes, the ICC codes, and what we enforce on a daily basis. So you potentially could have a question on one of your exams that says, does a church with an occupant load of 310 people require an automatic fire sprinkler system? And on the test, you're going to have 4 answers, multiple choice. Yes, no, no, you don't need it, provided there's fire extinguishers, or no, there may be more than 2 exits. But you've read that and you've said to yourself, hey, we just finished building a church in our jurisdiction in central Ohio, and the occupant load was 375 people. And in that situation, we didn't require suppression. So just looking at that question that was there, I'm not even going to look in the book because yes, my occupant load is over 300, but as I said, we built a church in Ohio for 375 people and we didn't put a fire suppression system in it. So I'm going to choose no, it does not need to be suppressed. What you find though is in the Ohio Building Code section under 903.2.1.3, in the state of Ohio, a group A3 occupancy with a fire area with an occupant load of 300 or more in a church, provided those seats in that church are fixed to the ground, you do not have to have a fire suppression system. In that same code section, in the International Building Code, where they're going to be they could be taking that test question out of, a church occupancy with a fire area that has an occupant load of 300 or more requires that building to be suppressed. So this is just one example of an Ohio code that is completely different from the international code model code. And so if you were only studying the Ohio Building Code and never ventured into the model code, this could be one instance where you answered that test question incorrectly. Are storm shelters required in a new school building with an occupant load greater than 50? Once again, in the state of Ohio, under our current code today, in section 423.5, school occupancies are not required to have storm shelters. But under the 2021 International Building Code, every single school building that is newly built must be provided with a storm shelter. They do have a few exceptions in there, but again, these are two completely different, same code section, but different results from the state of Ohio and the model code. And just one more, in a high-rise building, is egress path marking required on stair treads in an exit stairwell? So in a high-rise building, on your exit stairs, do you have to put this luminous path lighting on all your treads? Under the Ohio Building Code, those tread markings are not required. If you do choose to put them in, you have to follow the requirements for that section of the code, but they are not required in the state of Ohio. But if they ask you this question on the test, they are required because that is not an exception in the International Building Code model code. And I often get asked, this does, this is so difficult, we're in the state of Ohio, we enforce the Ohio code. Why don't they test us on the Ohio code? Well, again, the national certification testing boards, they're testing everybody in the state throughout the United States. And so they're not going to make the test specific to the state of Ohio. They're going to make that test based on the model codes. And so as you're going through this process, it really is important to understand that you can, if you want, study directly from the Ohio Building Code. And if that's the code libraries that you have in your office and that's what you're going to study from, that's fine. It's just that you do have to understand that potentially, because there are differences between the model code and what we enforce, you potentially could be answering something wrong if you're referring back to the Ohio codes. Let's talk a little bit about the code book structure. Each code book, no matter which code book you go into, is going to start with a table of contents. They're going to have the administrative section, which basically talks about how are we going to enforce the code. Our chapter 2 is always going to have a definition section in it. And basically those are key terms that are used throughout the code book and what the meaning of those key term words are. And then each code will go into general requirements, move on to specific requirements. And then we always have our reference standards and our index at the rear of the book. So what you see right across here in this chart, we have the building code, we have the residential code, the mechanical, and the plumbing. And as I said, if you open each one of those books, they will all start with the table of contents. They will all again have the chapter 1 administration talking about how you use this specific code. It moves into our chapter 2 definitions. And then depending on which book you're in, there are multiple chapters on the specific requirements that we have in that book. In the last code cycle, in the Ohio Building Code, we actually had a chapter 34, which was its own chapter that we discussed how do we regulate existing structures. But as of last Friday, under the new code that we're enforcing right now, we no longer have a chapter 34. They actually took that chapter 34 out of the book. And now we have a completely new standalone book. It's called the 2024 Existing Building Code. And then these all end with our reference standards, and then we move on to the index. One of the things that's important to know is you are going to need to know, you can say, well, I'm just going to get a residential certification, but you have to understand if you're a residential building official and you're going to sit down to take the exams, you're going to have to know the residential building code, the mechanical code. You're going to be taking a mechanical code test, and then either the electrical or a plumbing test. And so again, you are going to have to know the requirements in some additional manuals. If you happen to be a residential, going for your residential plans examiners, again, you're going to get information out of the Residential Code of Ohio. You are also going to be taking either the mechanical exam and then either an electrical or a plumbing exam. And then for the residential building inspector, you will be taking your residential building inspector exam. Now, if this is the first time you're approaching these code books, and maybe I don't know what all your backgrounds are, but if you're just coming into code enforcement and you've never really had any experience with a code book, if you are taking the exam and trying to learn the residential building code book, that's probably one of the easiest books to get to understand, because that book actually follows the format of how you would build a house. Before we even start to build a house and dig a hole in the ground, the first thing we do is we sit down and we actually design it. And so in chapter 3 of the residential code book, chapter 3 tells us what are all the components that need to be in that residential home to make it a residential structure. And so, like before we get the permit, we actually sit down with the builder or the architect and we design that house, and everything we need to know about what needs to be in that home is going to be found in chapter 3. And then after we design the house, the next thing we would do is build it. And the first thing we start with is our foundation. We have to build that foundation in order to build our structure. And once we build that foundation, we put the walls on, or the floor on. And after that floor is on, we can build our walls. And after our walls are up, we can build that roof. And so the residential code book follows basically that construction process. So chapter 4 tells us all about our foundations. Chapter 5, all about our floors. Chapter 6 goes on to our wall construction. And each chapter after that is the exact process you would do as you build the house. So a good idea is, if you're taking the exam and you have a question about the foundation, if you have to start looking through that book, that's going to be closer to the front of the book. If you have a question about the mechanical systems, or maybe something in the plumbing systems, that's going to be towards the back of the book. Where it gets a little different, if you are actually taking your commercial exam for building and you are using the building code book, the building code book is not at all set up like the residential code book. It's more of a design format, not a building format. It really follows the design process, because as an architect sits down to design a commercial building, the first thing we have to do is we have to go into chapter 3 and look as what is the use and occupancy of that building. Because before you can go anywhere else in that code book, you have to specify the occupancy of that building. Based on that occupancy, the next chapter is 4. You could actually have special requirements. If it's a mall building, or if it's a high-rise building, or if it's a parking garage, there are special requirements that have to be followed based on that use. So once you get through chapter 3 and 4, you can move on to chapter 5, which is our building height and area tables. And that's basically going to tell us how big we can build that building, how many stories, what the maximum allowable floor plan area can be, how tall that building can be. And once we have our area and we have our occupancy, we can go to chapter 6, which tells us the different type of constructions that we're allowed to build that in. Are we just going to build this building in wood? Are we going to build it in a combination of wood and concrete, or wood and brick? Are we going to build it completely out of concrete? And so chapter 3, 4, and 5 all really play into one another. You have to go back between all of those as you're putting a building together. And then once we have determined actually how we're going to put that building together, then we can move on to chapter 7, which talks to us, how are we going to protect that construction? If that building that we're building has a floor that has to have a 1 or a 2 hour fire rating assembly, it's going to tell us what we have to follow. And then we move on to our fire protection systems in chapter 9. Chapter 10 is going to tell us how we get out of that building for our means of egress. 11 is going to be our accessibility. And so again, as you can see, this format does not follow the format of how we build a building like we do in the residential book. It's more of a concept, how you actually design a building. And so a lot of people who first open the building code book and are not familiar with it, it is really hard to get a grasp of how this book is put together. What I would highly encourage out there is this book developed by Francis Ching, and it's called Building Codes Illustrated. And I've had this book in my library for many years, and I've lent it out to many individuals who have trouble understanding the building code book, because what this does, it actually takes what you see in the code book and it brings it down to understanding the code concepts through illustrations. And this is a great guide to have in your library, or maybe you have it in your building department library. And if you have it, use it. If you don't, I would highly encourage you to get it, because it really gives you a good visual on a lot of the ideas behind the building code book. The other books that we have out there, code books out there, are developed by the NFPA, which is the National Fire Protection Association. And we, as code officials, have to use many of these books. Probably the two most popular ones are the NFPA 13, which deals with our fire sprinkler systems, and the NFPA 70, which is our National Electrical Code. But just like our international codes that are out there, this code series also starts out with a table of contents. Then the beginning chapters talk about how are you going to administer the code. Then it gets into your definitions. Then it goes into chapters with your general requirements. And then it moves on to your specific installations. And then, as all of these books have, they have indexes at the end of them. Now, just like I showed you in the last couple slides, each of the code books is kind of outlined and broken down in the same way. Each of the code sections or chapters are also structured in the same way in each one of these books. So within each chapter, you are going to find that that general section starts out to define exactly what is the scope that we're going to be discussing in this specific chapter. And then once you get on beyond the specific scope, it's going to lead into the individual topics based on that chapter. And again, if you look at these 4 code manuals, they all start out with a general section. What are we talking about in this specific chapter? And then we move on to our specific sections. And the same thing with the NFPA. We all start out with general, and then we move on to specific. NFPA, at least the National Electric Code, sometimes it's a little difficult because they use articles and they use Roman numerals for specific headings. But also within each chapter, you'll find in the National Electric Code that they always start out with a general section. It moves into how are we going to install what's within this chapter, and then what are the construction specifications of what we are installing. Just to let you know, a lot of you, there may be many in this class today who are going to be plans examiners. I remember it was a big wake-up call when I first became a plans examiner, because I thought all I was really going to be reviewing was building plans. But what you find out as a plans examiner, 50% of your workload is basically going to be fire alarm systems and fire sprinkler systems. And so in order to review those, you have to be very familiar with the NFPA 13 series, as well as NFPA 72 for fire alarms. If you're in this class today and you're going for your residential plans examiner, you are going to have to know how to use the NFPA 13D for residential structures. And if there are any fire plans examiners, you will need to know NFPA 13 for sprinklers and NFPA 72 for fire alarms. I don't know if we have any fire inspectors in the class today, but if you are out there, you are going to have to take two modules. There's going to be a commercial fire alarm inspector module and a commercial sprinkler inspector module. And so if you're taking the fire alarm inspector module, you have to know quite a few different books out there. They're going to be taking questions out of the International Building Code book, the International Fire Code book, your NFPA 72 for fire alarms. You are going to be referencing stuff out of the National Electrical Code, and then two other manuals, the fire alarm signaling system and the pocket guide to system installation. So again, there's a lot of books you need to know if you are a fire inspector. As well, for the sprinkler inspector module, you need to know quite a few of the NFPA books on fire sprinklers for your commercial installations, your residential occupancies, the manuals on the standpipe and hose systems, pumps, water tanks, service mains, and the NFPA 25 that covers the inspection, testing, and maintenance of all these different types of systems. So there is quite a bit to know out there. So really, when you look at the code book structure, it really is important to familiarize yourself with the table and contents. And this is any of the books that you are looking at. And you really want to begin to understand what each chapter is discussing. I would highly recommend that you purchase tabs for your code books. This really helps out when you're taking the exam because you don't have a lot of time to answer a question. And it's good to have these tabs because a lot of times, one, they break down the chapter, so you have a tab for each chapter. But within each chapter, there are a lot of important tables. And a lot of times, a lot of the test questions are taken off those important tables in those chapters. And so having the tabs on your code book, that's a very good resource. And then just another aid that helps you with getting through this code book pretty quick. And then, as I always say, you always want to use the index that's in the back of these code books because many of the key terms that are used in the construction industry and in the exam questions, you will actually find within the index. So let me take you, as you're studying for your exam, it doesn't matter what exam you're studying for, but what we're going to do here is do a code question analysis. And so, this could be a technique that you use as you study a flashcard. Maybe you're going through a study guide, or maybe you've actually gone online and you're doing an online test, or you're doing an online study guide. And so what you really want to do is you want to be able to take that test question and learn how to break it down into different parts and analyze that question and really find out what is that question really being asked of us. Now, as I take this test, as I teach this class, when we're actually in a auditorium and doing it live in a room, I am glad to see that a lot of younger people are actually coming into this profession. But for those of you who are older like myself, and we go back to grammar school, there was a time where we used to what was called diagramming sentences. And we sat in English class and we had to take a sentence and we had to break it all apart into all its little different components like you see on this diagram. And that's kind of what we want to do as we're studying to take this exam. We want to take that study question and kind of break it apart so we can find out what's really in that test question. So this is a 5-step approach, and it may seem cumbersome, but we have time. We don't have to jump and take the exam tomorrow. We have to build our study schedule, and so this is a very good way to analyze the question as you're studying it. So step 1 is we want to make sure we read the entire question. Step 2 is, do we understand what the meaning of that question is? And then we move on to step 3, do we start picking out some of the key words in that question? Step 4, now that we have our understanding the meaning and we know what the key words are, let's first go to our table of contents in the front of the book and look through that to see if we can find out where it might be in the book. And then the last thing is, if we can't find it through the table of contents, let's go to the back of the book and use the index. So let me take you through a question. So the first step 1 is we want to make sure that we read the entire question from beginning to end. And so I'll just read: permanent platforms are permitted to be constructed of fire retardant treated wood for types 1, 2, and 4 construction, where the platforms are not more than blank inches above the main floor and not more than 1/3 of the room floor area and not more than 3,000 square feet. So step 2 is we've read it all the way through, and so I kind of want to understand the meaning of what this is asking for. So I think this question pertains to the construction of some type of platform in this building. So step 3, let's go ahead and pick out what might be the key words, just like we used to diagram sentences. Let's start picking out the key words, and I think really the key word in this question would be permanent platform. So now that I have that keyword permanent platform, the next thing I want to do is step 4 is let me go to the table of contents. So I'm going to go to the front of my code book and I'm going to open up the table of contents. I'm going to start right from the beginning in chapter 1, and I'm going to scan down each chapter one by one and look at the subsections within each chapter and see if I can find anything that might pertain to a permanent platform. And so as I start going down through my table of contents, I don't really see anything until I get to chapter 6, which talks about types of construction, but I don't really see any heading there. And I keep going down and I eventually get to chapter 23 that talks about wood. And I think, well, maybe a platform might be constructed out of wood, but I don't see any subsection under chapter 23. And I keep going and I find a chapter 31 that talks about special construction. Well, maybe platform is a special construction, but I don't really find anything under chapter 31. So I get all the way to the end of my table of contents and I say, I don't really find anything through going the table of contents. Let's go ahead and check the index. So now I go back to the index in the back of the code book, and sure enough, I find the keyword platform, and then under the platform, it has a subheading of construction. So I jump to section 410.3, and sure enough, it tells me all about that platform construction, and it's in this location where I actually find that 30 inches is what I am looking for that question. So again, this is a case where maybe the table of contents didn't really help us out, but we were able to find what we were looking for in the index. Now let me take you through just one more question. And so again, we read the entire question. For areas having fixed seating without dividing arms, the occupant load shall not be less than the number of seats based on one person for each blank inches of seating length. And again, I've read the in question. We want to understand the meaning. So I believe this pertains to the occupant load based on the seating. And when I go to step 3, I want to pick out some of the key words. So I think fixed seating and occupant load would be two of the key phrases within this question. And again, I want to start with the table of contents. And since this question deals with the occupant load and the occupant load deals with egress from a space, maybe you might scan through chapter 10, but nothing under that table of contents lists anything for fixed seating. So as I go through my exercise of going through the table of contents and find out I don't see anything there, I go ahead and check my index. And as I'm looking in the index, I don't find fixed seating, but I do locate seating fixed. And that tells me to look under chapter, under my occupant load. And if I go to section 1004.6, I basically find what I'm looking for to answer that question. Again, this is an example where maybe the table of contents didn't help us out. I went to the index to find out what I was looking for to answer this question. So usually about this point, after I've gone through those two examples, either you're thinking it in your head, or when I've sat in many classes and someone raises their hand and says, Paul, you just showed us two examples where going through the table of contents was no help at all. Why didn't you just strictly go right to the index, because you showed us in those two examples that you found what you were looking for from the index? And I said, you're probably right. I'm going to tell you that about 99% of what you're looking for is going to be right out of the index. But there are going to be those situations when you're taking the exam that you will go to the index and you will not be able to find what you're looking for. And so this might be a question: asphalt shingles shall be fastened to blank, solidly blank decks. And so our key word or topic for this question would be asphalt shingles. So let's go ahead and skip the table of contents. Let's just jump directly into the index. And I find out that asphalt shingles is not a category in the index. Shingles is not a category in the index. But all along, if I've been studying, as I've been studying, and I really know every single chapter within that book, and I've studied my table of contents over and over and over again, I know that chapter 15 is all about roofing assemblies. And so if I can't find something in the index, I know that, hey, I can't find what I'm looking for, but I really know that chapter 15 is all about roofing assemblies. And so instead of going all through the book looking for this answer, let me go focus on chapter 15, and I'm sure I can find it there. Even looking in the index, roofing isn't listed in the index. The first thing you come across is roof assemblies, and that also has roof construction and wood and roof coverings. So this would be an example where maybe that index would not have helped you out. And the last thing you want to be doing is, as you're taking the exam, again, we're looking at ways to decrease anxiety. And so the last thing you want to be doing is going to that index and not finding out what you were looking for. But if during this entire process you're studying, you have become very familiar with what's in the table of contents, if you can't find it in the index, you pretty much should be able to know what chapter you need to go through to look for your answer. And then just one other quick question. You may come across flush controls shall be located on the blank side of the water closet. Again, if I was doing this question, I would say that my flush controls is probably what I'm looking for. But what you will find out is that, you have to reference, for this question, you would have to reference the ICC A117.1. That's a book that is for accessible and usable buildings and facility. And what you're going to find out is that within that manual, flush controls is not a category in the index. Controls is not a category in the index. And of all the manuals that are out there, this one specific manual really doesn't have a whole lot in that index. And so knowing that flush controls deal with toilets, if you knew your table of contents in the A117 document, you would know that chapter 6 deals specifically with plumbing elements and facilities. And so you would know that to go to chapter 6 to look for those, that answer to that question. So again, as we conclude with part 1 of this class, the most important thing is not to memorize the code. We have to refer back to the code. And right now, for a lot of us who have been in the code for a long time, more than ever, you really now have to start referring back to the code, because, as I said, as of last Friday, we're under a new code cycle, and there are a lot of changes that are in this code cycle. So it's more important now than ever that before we jump ahead and answer a code question, to really start to refer back to it. And if you have learned how these code books are structured, there should be no reason why you can't find that in a code book. Even though the codes have changed and they made updates, I know exactly where to go in the code book to look for it. I showed you some examples that there are differences between what we enforce and what we will actually be taking the test questions out of. Again, I think it's important that we understand the overall structure of the book. Once we understand the structure, understand the chapter structure. So how is each chapter actually structured? And then most important, learn the table of contents. I think when you get a good grasp and a handle on the table of contents, you get a good grasp of the overall book and where everything is within that specific code book. And then the last thing is use the index. As I said earlier, when you do take an exam, just about anything you can find, you'll probably be able to find it in the index, but there is always going to be one or two questions on that exam that's not going to be located in the index. And in that case, you don't want to add to your anxiety. So you really want to know where else to look in the book. And as I said, if you know that you've studied your table of contents, you shouldn't have any reason why you couldn't find what you're looking for. So with that, that really concludes our part one of this. I don't know if anybody has any questions. Just put some slides up here. Job site ladder safety. I always get a kick going on the internet and finding unique ways that people like to do things out in the field. What about junction box fill? I know each box can only have so many wires in it. I'm pretty sure you don't need to be an ESI to know that they overfilled that junction box. And I never thought that my Craftsman screwdriver would make a good fuse. Okay, let's start part two, which is our techniques for studying. I think the part of this and what a lot of people have is many individuals will get overwhelmed when it comes time to start studying, knowing that they have to take a test. We want to be able to find ways to decrease these feelings, and we want to be able to find comfort in the material. I think the best example I always like to give is if I took each of you individually and took you into a testing room and said, today I'm going to give you a test about yourself, you would have no problem taking that test because you are very comfortable. You know all the material that you need to know about yourself. And so I'm sure you would walk into that room and say, I'm really confident because I am familiar with the information that they are going to ask me about myself. So in the same way, I think we really want to understand where the material is that they are asking us on these test questions and where is it located within the specific code book. And each of the answers that is in that test are going to come directly from the code book. And because you are allowed to take these code manuals in with you to the exam, as long as you can navigate your way through that code book, there's no reason why you should not be able to find what you are looking for. Now, it's important to know as we're preparing to take these exams, and you want to start this early on, you really want to make sure that you know what the test procedures are. And so, as I said, the first thing when you get out of Code Academy this week, if you haven't done so already, you first want to determine which exam path are you taking. Are you going through the ICC or the NCP CCI exam route? And once you've laid out that path, then the next thing to do is to go to the website for both of these testing centers and really find out, what do I need to know as I'm taking these exams. The ICC exams are offered through the Pearson VUE testing centers or Proctor, and then the NCP CCI are actually offered through a different organization called Prove Exams. Now, when you go to each of these websites, they are going to tell you, after you find the exam that you need to take, they are going to give you all the information you need to know for taking these exams. And the same thing with NCP-CCI, you can find their website. And again, they're going to tell you which exams they offer and what you need to know in order to take the exams. And when you go to NCP-CCI, they actually have their own page on the state of Ohio, which is specific to us and what we need to take based on what you found on that examination matrix that's put together by the Ohio Board of Building Standards. So again, did you review the Board of Building Standards examination matrix? Are you going to take the ICC or the NCP-CCI exam? Do you know there are different exam modules based on which path you're taking? For those who are building officials, you can only go the ICC route because the NCP-CCI does not offer exams for building officials. A lot of times when I'm giving this class, people will ask me, Paul, is there an advantage taking the ICC or the NCP-CCI? And what I often like to tell people is there still is a choice that you have to make. But I will tell you that ICC, if you take the ICC exams and you keep up with those certifications, the ICC has reciprocity. Those exam certifications that you receive, ICC has reciprocity in many of the states throughout the United States to accept those. So if you were deciding to, if you knew that you were going to move to another state and you want to take your exams with you, certifications with you, there are a lot of other states out there that will just allow you to take your ICC certifications and become certified in those states for their respective inspector positions. For NCCP-CCI, they're pretty limited in their reciprocity. Their reciprocity will go to the state of Indiana, Kentucky, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Oklahoma, and Virginia. So maybe if you knew down the road you were going to be moving to one of those states, or maybe in a couple of years you're going to retire to one of those states, that may be something to think about. That I might want to take that exam because I know that one of those 6 states is where I'm going, and I know that that exam will be accepted in that state. Most of the people now are doing the online exams. I took my exam so long ago, they weren't offering them online. Every exam that I ever took was actually at a testing center, an off-site testing center. But I think now the good thing about the online exams is that basically you can either be taking that exam in your house, or you can be taking that exam maybe in a conference room or someone's office in your place of employment. And I think the nice thing about that is that you're actually taking that exam in an environment that is comfortable to you. A lot of times going to a testing center, that can be quite cumbersome. You're going to a building that you don't know. You're actually going into a testing room that you're not familiar with. And so a lot of times that leads to anxiety. So I think when you're doing an online test now, it is nice to have the option to be able to sit in a location that you're familiar with. And I believe that will also help you decrease some of your test anxieties. As I said, if you're not comfortable with that, there are some testing centers based on the exam. If you're going through the ICC route, there are still some testing locations in the Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, and Toledo areas. But since more people are moving to online testing, a lot of these testing centers are getting away from the ICC exams. And then the Prove exam, which does the NCP-CCI, they still have testing locations in Akron, Fairfield, Rio Grande, and the Youngstown areas. Sometimes I ask, does anyone want to share their testing experience site? Since we're online today and we're not really in a classroom, 2 examples that I got from 2 past participants when I was teaching this class that I'd like to share with you is when you're doing the online testing now, they do have online proctors, and that online proctor is basically going to tell you what you can and cannot do while you're taking the exam. And one of the most important things when you're taking these exams is that that proctor needs you to be in view of that computer at all times. And I had an individual in one of my classes that said he decided to take that test at home. He did it through ICC, through the Pronto exam, and he was taking that test at home from his office in his house, and he had left the door to his office open. And in the middle of the exam, his dog happened to venture in, and his dog started to bark. And so he got up to remove the dog from his office and close his door. And in doing so, he actually stood up and was no longer within sight of the computer. And so when he came back and sat down at the test, the proctor basically stopped the exam at that point and said, "You have now violated the procedures for online testing. You have gotten up and you have moved away and you are no longer within view of the proctor." And so he had to shut down, and he had to take that test all over again, and he had to pay another fee. And so it is very important that you follow the instructions as you're taking these online tests and know exactly what these are. I had another individual who had also taken their test at home, and she didn't have the greatest Wi-Fi capability in her house. And so she was actually living at home with her parents and some of her siblings. And she had said, during this 2-hour period, could I ask you to be out of the house because I want to make sure that the house is quiet and I just have the whole house to myself and I don't have anyone else using the bandwidth of the Wi-Fi in the house. And so she had a 2-hour exam, and sure enough, her family ended up coming back to the house too early. And what had happened is when they walked in and their devices started hooking up to the house Wi-Fi, she ended up losing some of the bandwidth, because the bandwidth, it actually does take quite a bit when you're taking the exams. She actually lost the bandwidth, and she had some issues while she was taking the test. And so she was able to resolve it, and she was able to continue on and finish the exam. But she said it did lead to a lot of text anxiety while that happened. And you can imagine she found that to be frustrating. So again, they are also going to test your bandwidth capability, because it is a pretty strong program, but you can all get that done prior to you taking the exam. So more about knowing the test procedures, I'm just going to show you one test if you were taking the building inspector certification, and to show you that there are different modules between ICC and the NCP-CCI. If you were going the ICC route, you would be taking 2 exams. If you were going to the NCP-CCI, you would actually be taking 3 exams, because they break down the commercial building inspector exam through the ICC. They actually cover your fire protection within that exam. When you're taking the NCP-CCI, their building module is just strictly on building, and they actually have their module fire protection, which discusses all the fire protection requirements of a building. That's its own exam. But if you took the building inspector exam through the ICC, as I said, you were taking 2 exams, 2 modules, and within the B2 module, you would have to know information would be coming out of the 2021 International Building Code. There would also be referencing the building code requirements for structural concrete, and also stuff out of the construct concrete manual. And so this is an 80-question test. It's 3.5 hours, and it cost you $305. As I said, I just taught this class back in November of last year. And when I taught that class, at the time, that test was $241, but now it has now jumped up to $305 to take that exam. So that's the other thing to think about. If you go the ICC route, usually every year, the exam prices go up all the time. NCP-CCI has stayed pretty consistent with their exam price. I can tell you when I took my exams probably about 15 years ago, I was paying $120 per exam. And you can see over the years, these exam prices greatly increase. So it is important. You only want to take these once because getting these certifications is an expensive endeavor. In addition to the code books that some of us have to purchase and the exams we have to take, they get pretty expensive. And so I think that's another reason why it's pretty important to really have a good study program. And then your mechanical component is going to be 50 questions, and that's a 2-hour exam, and that's also $305. Now, if I go through the NCP-CCI route, again, you have 3 modules, so you're going to have to know a little bit more. I talked to you earlier in the class today about being able to know the code structure for the NFPA 13 and the NFPA 72, which is your sprinklers and fire alarm. Because if you do the NCP-CCI route in their fire protection module, the questions will be coming out of those manuals. And then you'll also have to know the mechanical code and the fuel gas code. Now, of these 3 modules, each module is only 50 questions, and their exam price is $130 per exam. So although you're taking 3 exams, you do have less exam questions and your exam cost is a little less. So what I did here just for this one specific exam, and you can do this for any exam, I just kind of put a little matrix together. So if you were going to take your building inspector exam and you went through the ICC, you would be taking 2 exams. You would have to have knowledge in 5 code manuals. The total of those 2 exams would be 130 questions, and taking that one time, it would be $610. Going the NCP-CCI, again, it may be 3 exams, so you're taking 1 more. You do still have to know information of 5 code manuals. You are going to have a couple more questions, 20 more questions overall. But really your cost is going to be $309. So again, it's really how do you feel? Do you just want to take 2 exams with more questions, 2 exams with maybe less questions but more cost, or would you feel more comfortable taking 3 exams with less dollar amount? So after you decided again which route you're going to go, what is pretty nice is when you go to each of these exam, the online catalog for either of these exam testing centers, you can actually go to your specific exam and you can actually look at what they do is they do a breakdown of what percentage of questions are coming from what portion of that code book. And this is really good to know because what you will find in this case, here was the commercial building inspector exam, and you can actually pull up and print out what percentage of the questions are coming from. And if you were studying the code book and maybe you were and you knew that basically most of the questions for the commercial building inspector exam, they say the highest percentage of questions come out of the chapters dealing in wall construction. And so if you knew that that was a chapter that you were having trouble with, you could actually say, I'm going to spend more time focusing on those sections of the code that deal with wall construction because I know that that's where a lot of the questions are going to come from. You will find out that general administration, which is your chapter 1 of that code, only 6% of the exam questions on that exam are going to deal with chapter 1. So really, you're only going to get 1, maybe 2 questions coming out of chapter 1. So you don't really want to focus a whole lot of time studying those sections. So it's a good breakdown of where most of the questions are coming from. And you can really see as you're studying the code book where you really need to be focusing your efforts on. Also, what code year? You now have the option when you're taking the exam, you can either take the exam right now out of the 2018 international codes, or you can take them out of the 2021. I think what's important right now, and as we are transitioning, or we have just transitioned into our new code, the codes that we're now enforcing in the state of Ohio, which is our 2024 code, that's based on the 2021 International Code Cycle. And so what is kind of nice about that now is there are changes between the two, but there aren't as many changes as there were with the old code cycle. So our old code cycle, which was the 2017 Ohio Building Code, that was actually referenced out of the 2015 model code. And right now, you can no longer test out of the 2015. And so we're in a point right now where you have the option to either take the test out of the 2018 or the 2021, but I would recommend doing the 2021 code, because now we're really close and in sync with what we are enforcing in the state of Ohio. At the beginning of this chapter, I talked about, how do we create a comfort level with the code book? It's really, this isn't going to occur overnight or even within a week. This entire process takes time. As I said, I've been doing this for 22 years, and I still develop different levels of experience in certain codes. There are certain code manuals and code books that I am in all the time. There are some books that I don't have to go to that often. And so with those, I'm not too familiar with. But the familiarity is going to come as we use these books. And we are going to develop a better understanding on where to look for that answer as we become more familiar and have a comfort level with these books. Many years ago, as I said, I'm a plans examiner, and I'm very familiar with NFPA 72 and the NFPA 13 series on sprinklers and fire alarm systems, because many of my plans, plan reviews focus on those type of systems. But many years ago, it was the first time we're finding more and more, a lot of businesses have their computer rooms, and a lot of these computer rooms have clean agent systems put in them. And that actually has its own NFPA. It's the NFPA 2001 document, which references the code requirements for a clean agent system in a computer room. And so it was the first time I was doing a plan review using that standard, but I wasn't overwhelmed at all, because I had a very good understanding of how the NFPA had structured their books. And so when the first time I opened the NFPA 2001, it was structured the exact same way as the NFPA 13 and the NFPA 72. And so as I was doing my plan review, I knew exactly how to go through that new standard. Even though it was completely new to me, I understood where I needed to be looking for that information on that plan review I was doing. So you are going to get a comfort level over time with these books, and it's just going to grow over time. It's not going to happen overnight. So if you're just starting this process, don't get frustrated. You will eventually get there. I think it's also important to put your mindset in the mindset of the structure you are studying. Whether or not you're studying for your building exam or your plumbing exam or your electrical exam, I think you really want to kind of, focus on what is that specific trade looking for? What are they doing out in the field? What should I be looking for on the drawings? And really put your mindset in that subject. Also begin to look for interconnections between you're studying for, because this code book is just not a random list of things that you're supposed to memorize. Really, it is a system of interconnected ideas. And really learn to understand the language and take visual clues from the code books, the code commentary books. When I started in this process, as I said, I left the architectural field, went into the code enforcement field. I had no idea that there was international fuel gas code. And so the first time I opened that book, it was completely unknown to me. And so I actually was fortunate enough. Uh, my office actually had a code commentary book. The ICC puts out many commentary books on these codes. And that's a great resource to have if you don't have those in your office, because in each one of those books, it takes every single code section, and then it actually gives a commentary on that section. So it really explains what that code section is about. And then it also, on many of these, it will either give you a drawing or it will give you a photograph of what that code section is explaining. And what made that really good is there were a lot of there's a lot of code terms that are used out in the industry, but they're not used in the code book. And so a lot of times I was reading code sections in this fuel gas code, and I'm like, what exactly is it that they're talking about? And when I went to the commentary, I would actually see a picture and I would say, oh, I know exactly what that is. That this is what they call it in the field. But there are a lot of terms that are not, in the construction industry, we have many terms, and a lot of those terms are not found in the code book. And so these code commentary books that the ICC publishes is a great resource if you're new to this field and you don't know a lot of the code terms that they're using within the book. Again, this is all an interconnected set of ideas. As I said, if you pick up the building code book for the first time and you were to sit down and try to read it like a book, you would think that it's the most ridiculous book that there was ever out there. But again, it follows a design process, and it's how we design a building. And again, even though it doesn't read like a book, or it doesn't read like putting a house together, it still is an interconnected set of ideas. And when you learn how it all works together, it does make a lot of sense. Now, as we begin to study, I just often like to ask, is this you? The blue part is things I do when I have to study. I spend a lot of time telling people I have to study, but I actually only spend a very little time actually focusing on that study. I think it's important as you start to set your schedule and you set your goal to take this exam, you really want to be realistic about a study schedule. I think when you're studying for an exam, you're also building more skills that will help you out in your job. You need to be in that code book every single day for your job. And even though you pass this exam, this learning is never going to stop. Our job is going to require us to go back to that code book. And as well, as you further on yourself in this career, you're also going to be taking more exams. And as you take more exams, you're going to have to know more books. But as you're studying for this exam, you really want to begin this process early. I know there are a lot of people that like to procrastinate and put this off to the end, but that's not really a good thing to go. And so you want to be realistic and start this process months in advance when you're studying for the exam. And maybe a good thing is, the state of Ohio Board of Building Standards has given you a 2-year interim period. And maybe what you want to do is you want to set some time within that 2-year period, set that date that you're going to take that exam. And that's something that becomes your goal and something you can kind of work back from on what you feel you need to meet all your requirements up to that goal. And it's never wise to cram for a test, because when we cram for a test, we're not building good study skill methods. We're not developing a system to learn this material. And it's just going to create too much anxiety as we're waiting to cram. To give you a perfect real world example is back in 2000, it wasn't 2009, but I was taking my exam to become a commercial plumbing inspector. And I had actually learned under the 2009 Ohio Plumbing Code, or the Plumbing Code. And at the time, it was in April of that year, I decided I was going to take the plumbing exam. And by June of that year, the end of June of that year, the ICC was no longer going to allow me to take the test out of the 2009 international code cycle. They were moving up to the next code cycle because they were in the transition period. And so I knew that in April, I knew that I had to take the exam prior to July 1st because I was really familiar with the 2009 edition of the code, and I didn't really want to have to learn a new code manual. So let me go ahead and take that exam. So it was the beginning of August, and I put some time off. And as I said, at that time, you really couldn't take online exams. You had to take it in the testing center. So towards the end of April, I said, I better call the testing center and take this exam, because in July, I definitely didn't have to take it after July because I would have to know a new code book. I was going on vacation in the middle of June, so I really wanted to have that test done before I went on vacation, because I didn't want to be bothered with thinking about it while I was on vacation. So I said, let me go ahead and set the exam for sometime the end of May. And that would kind of work with my schedule. So I got to the end of April and I called the testing exam center. And what I didn't realize is that during the month of May in the state of Ohio, it's the big month that all the nurses take their exam. And so I got on the phone and they said, we have no availability for you to come into the testing center to take the exam when you want it. But I'm looking at my schedule right now. It was a Thursday afternoon when I called. They said, we have one opening this coming Monday. I can get you in, or we're going to have to put you off to the end of June. And at that point, I said, no, I don't want to wait that long. That would be after my vacation and too close to the deadline that the state was changing the code book. And so it was Thursday, and I said, put me on that schedule date. And so I was a little frantic that weekend. I had 4 days to really brush up on everything. But again, these things can happen. And so that's why it's always important to really map this process out, because if we wait till the last minute, potentially this issue can happen. Now, luckily, I went and took my exam and I didn't have any issues and I passed it. But these things can happen. A lot of times people often ask, how many times can I actually take an exam? And so the ICC says you will have 6 exam attempts within a 6-month period, and you are responsible for paying the exam fee at every 6 attempts, which could get quite expensive. Once you have attempted an exam 6 times, you must wait 6 months from the first attempt to register again. So again, ICC allows you 6 times during a 6-month period. NCCP CCI just requires you to wait 30 days between any failed exam, but they give you no limit on how many times you have to take that exam. You just have to wait. You just can't go back the next day and take it. So again, consider this time framing when planning the date for your first exam. You don't want to do it at the end of your interim period, because if unfortunately you are unsuccessful, that could really screw your schedule up. So if you know you might have difficulty on the first time you're taking the exam, maybe you want to make it well in advance of that last 6 months of your interim period. And really begin after you leave, when you wrap up the Code Academy this week, really begin to map out how you're going to fit this all in your 2-month interim period. So let me show you what could happen with the requirements under the ICC, because you can take it up to 6 times, but once you take it that 6th time, you can't take it again from 6 months from the first time you started that process. And so let me show you this. So this calendar, I've mapped out this calendar year of 2024, and maybe last year on January 1st of 2023, you've got your interim period started, and basically now your 2-year period ends on December 31st of this year. And you keep putting off this exam and you keep putting off this exam, and July 17th of this year, you decide, I'm going to finally sit down and take that exam. So on July 1st, you take that exam, and unfortunately, you are unsuccessful. in passing that exam. So you come back in August, and again, you're unsuccessful, and hopefully this is not going to happen to anybody, but worst case scenario, this is an individual who didn't map it out and procrastinated and didn't study and just thought they were going to wing it. So they actually took this exam 6 times, and on December of this year, they take it for the 6th time and they fail. What ICC says, okay, if you're going to take that exam for the 7th time, we will go back to July 17th of 2024, and we are going to count 6 months from that date, and that's the next available time that you can take this exam. And so now that July 17th, the next available time is going to be January 17th of 2025. You are now outside your interim certification period, and you are no longer going to be eligible for that certification. And so whether or not the state's going to allow you to start that process over again, this is a situation you could put yourself in should you keep putting this off. So I think it's always important when you're mapping your 2-year period out to really, this could happen, it shouldn't, but if you're an individual who doesn't like to plan and likes to put everything off, this is something you just need to be aware of if you're taking the ICC exams.
Paul, can I speak to that point for just a quick minute?
Sure, sure.
Okay, so what Paul said is true. Your certification will expire on December 31st in the scenario he laid out. However, you have 1 year of being expired where you can complete all your requirements, including Code Academy and your exams, submit them to BBS with your application for full, and move to full status. However, you can't work with an expired certification, and you have to get it done within that calendar year. Otherwise, you've got to reapply for interim. You can't reapply for interim until 1 year has passed of you being expired. So best to plan and get it done within your current interim rather than putting yourself in a position where you can't work with your certification, or you are running up close to having that interim year of grace run out, and you would have to reapply for your interim. Just get it done. You're here at Code Academy, you've got half of it done. The next step is to just get those exams, study, prepare, get it done.
Thank you very much, Meg. I think that's important, a very important thing to know as well. As you said, building department budgets are tight. We're not as big as we used to be. And many years ago, I had an unfortunate situation where I was the building official. I did hire somebody with an interim certification. They had a year in which they had to complete their certification. And I stayed on top of this individual and I said, you really need to get working on this exam. Your interim period is up at this date. And after that date, if you don't have your exam, I really cannot use you because I need that exam in order for you to, I need your certification in order for you to do your job. Unfortunately, this individual kept putting it off, putting it off, and putting it off, and his interim period ran out, and he had no plan of when he was going to kind of take this exam. And unfortunately, at that point, I could no longer use that individual in my department because I needed him. He needed his certification to do his job. So unfortunately, he lost his job. So it is important not to scare you, but really to map this out and really develop your schedule to get this done within a 2-year period. As you're putting your schedule together and as you're studying, it is important to find a comfortable spot that is quiet and it really minimizes distractions. Choose a time of day that you will study and keep to that same time every day, and really choose a realistic study as you're putting as your schedule together. If we do something on a daily basis every single day for a little bit of time, that really takes away from the burden of this becoming part of your daily routine. And I think as you're going through this process, it is important that you make a pact with your family members or people that you might be living with, that as you're studying, this really is your time to be respected, because this is important what you're doing. This schedule becomes part of your commitment. And I said, make it a realistic schedule and make it part of your daily routine. When we make it part of our daily routine, you actually start to take away the burden of what we think we're doing. It's a lot easier to walk 1 mile each day than to kind of put everything off and walk 7 miles on a Saturday. A lot of us like to put it off and say, well, it was a hard day at work and I don't really want to study for an hour tonight. So on Saturday, I'm going to go and I'll just add another hour to my Saturday study schedule. But as you know, as we get through the week, we get to the end of the week and something pops up, and now all of a sudden we have to do something on the weekend that we didn't plan to do. And now that's taking into our study time. So if you keep it to a realistic schedule every single day, you will find out that it won't become such a burden. And one of the most important things, if you can take out of today's class, is really stay positive through this entire process. I've taken 10 exams. I only want to take them once. And as I said, now the exam prices have gotten so expensive. Some of them, some of our jurisdictions will only pay for that exam if we pass it. And so if it's coming out of your pocket, I think you only want to take this exam once. So stay positive. Tell yourself you can do this. There's no reason why you can't. This is part of your job. Your job requires you to have these exams. And as I said, building departments are getting smaller. With smaller building departments, we have to be able to do more with the staff that we have. And as people are out there, when I go out and I have to hire somebody, I really need to look to an individual that has multiple certifications, because our cities aren't allowing us to hire 2, 3, or 4 people. They want us to hire one person. That's what they'll give us the dollars for. And, the best person out there is going to be the person that has the most certifications. And in order to get that, you will have to go through this exam process many times. If you prepare yourself for this exam, there's no reason why you can't pass this exam. I just want to give you an example. When I first, in 2002, when I first became a building official, at that time, I was a registered architect. And at that time, if I wanted to be a plans examiner, all I had to do was take my my certification from the state of Ohio that showed me I was a registered architect, and submit that to the Board of Building Standards, and they would automatically have made me a master plans examiner. But as I said, I was new to the code enforcement career. So in that first year, I had an employment contract. Part of my employment contract said I needed to become a building official. So that was really where my focus was my first year working for a jurisdiction. And so I worked hard and I got my building official certification. And then I thought it was important that I did have to get out in the field. And so I got my building inspector certification. And a couple years went on and I got some more inspector certifications. And I said, you know what? After about 3 or 4 years, and I've been working there, I said, I think I'm going to apply for my plans exam certification. So I contacted the Board of Building Standards and I said, where do I go ahead and send my architectural registration in so I can get my master plans exam? And they said, we don't allow that anymore. We have changed our requirements. And now in order to be certified as a plans examiner in the state of Ohio, you're going to have to go sit through the Code Academy and you are going to have to take 4 exams. And so I can tell you that when I hung up the phone from the BBS on that day, I was screaming in my office. I was so upset with myself. Had I started this process earlier, all I would have had to done was submit a copy of my architectural registration. And so there was nothing at that point I could do about it. At the time, the interim period was only at 18 months. It wasn't like it is now 2 years. It was 18 months long, and I had to take 4 exams. But I said to myself, this was a certification I wanted. There was nothing I could do about it. I had to stay positive. So I went ahead and I studied hard and I passed my 4 exams and I got my master plans examiner certification. But when I look back on it now, I was really glad that it happened that way, because what that process allowed me to do is I really believe it made me a better code official, because it really got me into all those other code manuals that I probably would not have had I gone the other route. And so it made me, I think, a better architect, better code official, and a better master plans examiner. So although it was frustrating at that time, I did have to stay positive, and I think in the end, it actually made me a better person. Um, Talking a little bit about some study guide material, as I said, the ICC publishes a lot of code commentaries. I think they are excellent references out there as you're studying for the codes. The ICC has a lot of flashcards, and I highly recommend you to get turbo tabs, um, to put on your code books. That's going to help you out during the exam process. The ICC also provides many study companions for the different type of code books. And if you haven't already, there's a website here. It's called the ibcode.com, and that's the England Training Center. They're out of South Carolina, and they do a lot of very good online training, testing, and guides and classes. But if you subscribe to their email on a weekly basis, you will actually get an email from them, and they will actually send you code questions every single week. And I like to open up their email and just kind of test myself. They usually, each email every week has about 2 to 4 questions, and I get a kick out of testing myself on a weekly basis. I know sometimes purchasing code books can be expensive if your offices don't have them, but now you can actually utilize ICC's online public access. And then now all the building departments, as of March 1st, the state of Ohio has made us, given all building departments digital access to all the code books online. So that is a wonderful resource if you don't have the printed material. And then if you want to buy some code books, or actually want to sell some code books, you will be surprised. You can actually go on eBay and you will find people selling code books they don't need, or maybe you've purchased them for some exams and you want to get rid of them. It is a good way to offload those books if you don't want them. The ICC Online provides a lot of sample tests. I have heard from people that, oh, I've taken the online test on ICC and I score 100 times every time I take it, but then I went in and I didn't pass the exam. And what ICC is going to tell you is that the difficulty of the practice exams may not represent that of the actual certification exams. All they are trying to do is give you an idea of the different various styles and formats of questions that you will see on their exam. For those that will be taking any type of the electrical exams, I would highly recommend going to Mike Holt Publications. He has a lot of good resources, online resources, and testing material. I actually used a lot of his materials when I was taking my electrical plans exam certification, and that really helped me out throughout that process. And then you can also go to the International Association of Electrical Code Inspectors. They have good study guide materials there as well. I had actually picked up their plan review study guide, and that helped me out for the electrical plans exam certifications. And SOAR's grounding and bonding, I hear from a lot of individuals that they really like this this book when they're studying for their exams. There are also a lot of practice testing resources out there. There are a couple companies throughout the United States that give online testing, will actually do online courses, will actually promise you that if you take their exams and their online courses, that they will guarantee that you will pass the exam. So if after this class is over, if you want all of these links, you can go ahead and email me, and I'll be happy to send all these links on to you. As far as test scoring, ICC does not score based on the correct number answered correctly. They base on what's called a raw score. The difficulty in that is you never really know when you're taking the exam what question might be weighed more. another question. And when you take the ICC, you have to have a scaled score of 70 to pass. The NCP CCI is just a standard 70 to pass. I think it's important that you prepare your materials ahead of time. Do you have the correct edition of the code? What are you allowed to bring with you along to your exam? And do you need a calculator? And you want to make sure it's a battery calculator or a solar calculator. As I said, a lot of people now are no longer going to the testing centers. I went to the testing center, so I had to have a lot of stuff ahead of time, and testing center would only allow you to bring certain things in at a certain time. But now I think with the online, you'll review all that with the code proctor while you're there. Your code reference books, they must be bound. Photocopies are not permitted. If you have any notes written in ink in that book, it either has to be highlighted, or if it's written in pencil, you have to go and erase all of that. You are allowed to have tabs on your code books, but they have to be permanently attached tabs. If you have any post-it notes on your code book, those will have to be all taken off before you can start your exam. But again, before you take the exam, go to these either websites and they will tell you exactly what you can and cannot bring to the exams. And so they will actually show you what you can and cannot have. I do say that the night before the exam, never study. It's not wise to cram. I think if you've mapped out your study schedule and you've kept to it and you've been positive about it, you should be well prepared to go into that exam the next day. You really want to use the night before to really clear your head and use that time to relax. I know that's easier said than done. I know usually the night before an exam, there is a lot of anxiety, but try the best you can to get a good night's sleep, because that is going to be crucial to your performance on the next day. And so as we wrap up part two, really know the test procedures. So when you leave here, when you finish up, wrap up this week, first thing is to check your matrix, examination matrix. What path are you taking? Once you know what path you are taking, go to that respective website and really find out what you need to know, what the materials are you're going to need to be studying from, how many questions, how much it's going to cost you. Sit down and take your 2-year interim period and really map it out. Make yourself a realistic schedule. Keep that to your schedule. Prepare your exam checklist and really stay positive. And I think if there are any questions, you can pop those up. If not, we can move on to the last section, part 3 of this class. Just a couple photos. Do these plumbing fixtures have the proper fixture clearance? And I always love this one. Is a contractor really able to read the construction documents? Be careful when you put a revision cloud on your architectural drawings. Sometimes the contractors might actually think that's a hole that they're supposed to put through that floor, but kind of cute things we can find on the internet. So now we're just going to move into the last part. It's actually managing the exam process. You know, what are we really, what can really do during that process? And I think, does this happen to you? The human brain is amazing. It actually functions 24 hours for 365 days. It functions right from the time we were born, and it only seems to stop when we sit down and take an exam. Or I think isn't it funny how we can remember the lyrics to hundreds of songs, but we can't remember anything when we actually sit down and study for a test. So before we start the exam, as I said, we are moving. Most people now are doing the online exam. If you were going to a testing center, some people still want to choose that route. Get there at least 30 minutes before. You know, there's never anything wrong with showing up ahead of time, but when you start running late for your exam, that's when you start to increase your anxiety. I always say before you start that clock ticking on your exam, go to the bathroom. Even though you said, hey, I went to the bathroom a half hour ago, just try again. You'd be surprised. Some of that is unconscious, and just go to the bathroom. Set up all your materials. Make sure you know what you're allowed to have with you at the exam. Set that material up. And I always encourage you to do the tutorial. I took 10 exams, and every time I took the exam, you have the option to go ahead and skip that tutorial. But I didn't want to skip that tutorial because I wanted to make sure when I sat down for that exam that my computer was working, that I didn't have a key on that computer that wasn't working, or there wasn't something wrong. And so I actually, by the time I got to the 10th exam I took, I knew every single tutorial question that they asked and what the right question was. But I did it anyway, just to make sure that my computer was working. So during the exam,
it's exam day, and you're ready to take the next step in advancing your career, but not so fast. If you didn't watch our first video about what to do before the exam, stop what you're doing and go do it now. If you did, by all means, keep watching. This video will take you through the steps of what to do on exam day and walk you through some important rules. Exams can be taken either online with a proctor or in person at a testing center. We'll be demonstrating the steps for the online proctored exam, or Pronto as we call it, but the process is similar at a testing center. The first thing you'll need to do is navigate to My ICC. From there, select My Exams, then click on Take Exam. That'll prompt you to schedule your exam and then direct you to the Code of Ethics page. Read it. It's not that long, and if you violate them, this was all for nothing. After agreeing to play nice, find your exam and select Take Exam. That will prompt you to download the ProctorU extension. Follow the steps there to connect to your proctor. After exchanging pleasantries and accessing your computer's camera, the proctor will need to see a government-issued ID and get a 360-degree view of your exam location. This is about as good as any time to go over the rules, as the proctor will be looking to ensure your setting is free of anything that might be prohibited. Basically, your exam space should be empty except for any approved items. If your exam allows reference materials, they must be bound. All notes either highlighted or handwritten in ink, and any tabs must be permanently attached. So throw those Post-it notes away. We told you this before, but a list of approved reference materials for each exam can be found in the exam catalog. You can also use magnifying glasses, eyeglasses if needed, an architect's scale or ruler, foreign language to English translation dictionaries, and a battery-operated calculator that is non-programmable and capable of storing information and has no printing capabilities. There's a calculator built into the exam software, so if you have one of those fancy ones, just use this instead. A few other no-nos. No personal items such as purses, wallets, watches, or phones, copying, recording, or photo devices, or electronic devices other than the basic calculator mentioned earlier. Food and drinks are not allowed. Finally, any kind of writing instrument or paper to write on is prohibited. There is a notepad incorporated into the exam software, so use that instead. In-person exam sites offer a small whiteboard and marker. If you should break these rules, prohibited materials could be confiscated. You could be dismissed, or your exam score could be terminated. It's very important to the Code Council these exams be conducted with the utmost integrity, and that certifications are well deserved. Speaking of certifications, did you pass? We'll tell you how to figure that out in the next video.
So again, I talked a little bit earlier about doing the tutorial. This is not counted against your exam time, and it really allows you to figure out what you're going to be doing during the exam process. While you're taking the exam, if you get stumped on the first question, keep moving on and continue moving on until you actually get to a question that you can answer. Don't get discouraged if you don't know the first question. I was taking the plumbing exam, plumbing plans examiner certification, and I was blown away by the first question they asked on that exam. They were asking about friction loss and a pipe that was so many feet long and it changed diameter, and it just blew me away. But instead of focusing on that, I moved on to the next question. And it wasn't until I actually got to the sixth question that I could automatically answer. And so from question number 6 on, I had no issues, and it left me a lot of time at the end of the exam to go back and answer those I was having trouble with. So as I said, keep moving on until you can answer a question, and do not get discouraged. If this is the very first time you're ever taking an exam, they are multiple choice, and each question has 4 options and only one of those is correct. The exams allow you the options to mark those that you want to go back and look at. So I would highly recommend that you start with question 1 and you just work your way all the way to the end. And as you're going through, you can either skip one or you can mark it because maybe you did answer it, but you weren't exactly sure. And when you get to the end, you'll have time back and you'll have markings of which questions you wanted to go back to either just review or maybe some that you didn't have, didn't answer. And then, going from 1 all the way to the end is going to give you an idea where you're at the end of the exam. As I said, it's very important to read questions all the way to the end to make sure you understand what's being asked. A lot of times we are anxious while we're taking an exam. And sometimes what our mind happens to do is we begin to start to read the first part of the question. And then we're kind of looking at those 4 answers and we sometimes jump to conclusion. But it is always important to make sure that we read that question because a lot of times we could answer that wrong if we just jump to conclusions. Sometimes you're going to find out that they're going to be asking you to find the most correct answer. There could be a question that says, what is the maximum number of drainage fixture units that can be accommodated on a horizontal branch if the diameter of the pipe is 3 inches? And so if you were a plumber and you looked at this and you would say, well, when I go to this chart and it's pipe diameter is 3 inches and for horizontal branch, I can fit up to 20 DFUs. But if I go back and look at my answers, well, if I can fit up to 23 DFUs, answer number A, answer number B, and answer number C are all correct. But in this case, they would be looking at the most correct, and it would be 18. So just be aware of that. Many of the questions on your exam will refer you to a table in the code. Do not ignore the footnotes. Usually the answers to the questions can be found in the footnotes. I'm just going to skip this, but just an example of a footnote, you'll see these tables. If the exam question is referring you to a table, and within that table there's footnotes, it's usually 100% of the time the answer you're looking for is within those footnotes. So if you find that you're going to a table, the answer is most likely in the footnotes. For the plans examiners, they're going to refer you to a set of plans that's going to be provided on your computer in a PDF file. Some of the exam questions for plans examiner will require you to solve a problem. So there are going to be calculations and equations. But as you're studying for this process, what I would recommend is in the back of all the model codes for the plumbing, fuel gas, and electrical code books, you will actually find a bunch of sample equations. And so, as I said, if you look in the appendix on the back of the plumbing, fuel gas, and electrical, you won't find these in the Ohio codes. They'll just be in the model codes, but this is a great place to go because a lot of these type of questions are good to study from, and they also kind of appear on the plans examiner tests. What if I really don't know? You might find a question that you can't answer. You could probably eliminate 1 or 2, and that leaves you with a 50% chance of getting it right. So in that case, go with your gut. And some individuals have time left. Some just want to be done with the exam. Actually use this time to go back and review your questions. It's like having a second pair of eyes looking over the exam. I don't want you to go back and kind of second guess yourself, but there were situations where I did go back on a couple of exams and there were questions that I didn't read all the way to the end. And I remember going pretty quick on some of those. And when I went back a second time and read them, I said, oh my gosh, I read that the wrong way. I didn't read it all the way to the end. And I actually answered it wrong the first time. So really use that extra time if you have it to kind of go back and just look at some of the stuff you did. I know that doing all these things will not completely take away your test anxiety, but hopefully following some of these ideas will minimize the anxiety you may be feeling and make this process go a bit more smoothly. So I think to summarize
Can
today's
we skip
class, I
the
think,
video? Okay, good.
um, yeah, I skipped it. Do we have some time? I mean,
We really don't. We are
yeah,
running up against the next
yeah.
class.
So I believe to summarize today's class, I think in order to be successful in passing the certification exams, you will need an integrated approach by first learning to navigate that code book you're learning to study from. Develop a structured study program during this 2-year interim period, and then find out some ways to learn to manage the exam process. And I think not only will these tips help you in taking the exam, but they're also going to lead to good study habits in developing the process of finding solutions in the code book on a daily basis as a code official. And if we were still taking paper and pencil exams, I think when all else fails, this is the best way to solve a true false question. And with that, that really concludes my presentation for today. I'm going to say good luck on your study process. I hope all you got something out of today's class and will be able to use some of these tips as you're studying. And this is my email address. So after you leave today's class, if you have any other questions or some comments about today's class, feel free to reach out to me and I'll be more than happy to provide you with some additional information or some of those study guide websites that I showed in my presentation today. And with that, that concludes your first class.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. I think I learned some new things today. And if you want Paul's email address, email me. That's a great way to get that. And he also has offered in the past to send out PDFs of his slide deck on request. So if you want to email me for his email address, do so. Also, that certification exam resource that BBS has put together. We'll be happy to send that along to you. Always download the outlines from ICC for your exams. And on to the next class. I posted the link in the chat. See you all over in Chapter 1, Part 1.